in or out of county zoning. Chengwatan held back from that originally, but the statutorily the county has the right to extend its zoning authority over townships if you don't have your own regulations. So one of the objectives here is to at least explore the idea of having local government control over land use regulations applying to your town rather than leaving it up to the county. That's part of what's driving some of this project. And there's no fix determined outcome here yet. We're still in the exploration stage, but we're going to get to a point where we say if we adopt these, what are they going to look like, and what kind of impacts might they have on town government, on local property owners, etc. So we've been working on this since last fall, just kind of starting up, understanding what the land uses are in the township, what kind of the history of land development, not that development per se, but housing growth, agriculture, what kinds of issues the township faces from a land use standpoint, and if you do adopt these kind of regulations, how you might do that in a way that does the best for everyone as a entire township. We had kind of an early kind of exploratory public meeting here just a couple months ago, just to start out. Some of you may have been here for that. I think we had 30 or 40 people, so a number of you are a little new to the process here, so I'm going to try and walk through a little bit about what we're doing and what the project consists of. We're still in a kind of middle of this, so whatever you see on the board is stuff that came out of my office. I had a little feedback from town board members, but so don't get too worried about this as being final stuff. It's far from final, and we have a lot of work to do. And part of the purpose of this meeting tonight, as well as I appreciate all of you who have been answering the survey, and then going forward, there's still public hearings to happen. All of this stuff happens before anything gets adopted. So part of the purpose here is to kind of get more feedback. I hear what your reactions to these ideas are. I know when you kind of first step into this, it can be a little intimidating, and I understand that. I've worked for quite a number of townships, and so I understand the issues that townships face generally. What I'm interested in finding out specifically the issues that you face, so that you can manage land use in the way that you want to. And like I said, part of the original purpose here is to keep the kind of the rules and the opportunities in front of your local township officials as much as you can, and not rely on the county to do that, where there's a little bit of separation. So that's kind of where we are. The map over on the left is a map of existing land use, and when we break up a little bit here, you can come take a look at it. But I think this map might not even be part of my prior meeting presentation. But just this kind of apple green color that dominates the west half of the town. Those are all parcels that are agricultural parcels. They're identified in the county's classification system as ag. Everything else is something else, mostly residential. The white parcels are residential, less than 5 acres. The yellow parcels are residential parcels of between 5 and 10. The orange are between 10 and 20, residential parcels again. And then this kind of, I don't know, avocado green maybe? I don't know. Is our 40-acre parcels that are still classified as residential. So there are people that own more than 40 acres or more, but have a residential classification on them. So you can see the dominant acreage to the west part of the county is agriculture, but there are a lot of residential pieces that are spread through. And so part of the interest in creating land use management is how do you ensure that your farmers can keep farming, and residents can, make use of their property. And one of the things I heard early on, and I hear that continually through, the survey, is that, people are interested in doing as much as they can and being left alone as much as they can, to do what they want on their property, as long as they're not bothering their neighbors. I've seen that comment a lot. And, so the challenge with creating regulations is, where's the boundary, between where I'm doing what I want and where my neighbor's being unreasonably bothered. And that's always the challenge for zoning in any case, and particularly it's true in townships, because agriculture doesn't always fit next to what people think of as residential. And particularly if there's somebody who moved out here from the cities and they think, I got my 5 acres of paradise, and then there's seeding and plowing going on in the spring, and there's harvesting going on in the fall, and manure spreading, and who knows what else. All of a sudden, people think it's not quite as great. So trying to manage those conflicts is what zoning is all about. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we go forward here. But that's what's on this map. It's basically a chart of the various types of land uses that are by parcel throughout the township. And I got a couple others here. One's just kind of an aerial photo, and another one shows water, wetlands, and shorelands, and other land uses. You can see on the east, as I'm sure you all know, public lands are dominated by wetland and other water uses. So that's kind of the purpose that we're after. I think the objective here is to get to a finish for this project sometime in April. The township adopted a moratorium on new development to allow this process to go forward. And so we want to be at that end point by the time that moratorium is about to run out. I mentioned, and many of you I'm sure have probably responded to the survey. I was just looking at my stats on the survey here. November, December, January, I had about 30 responses. And over the last about 5 days, I've got 65 more. So we hit the 100 mark. So thank you for doing that. But because a lot of it is new, I don't have a whole lot of analysis done on it. I just kind of have the summary responses here. I didn't print out all the comments, and we've taken the comments seriously. There's a lot of opportunity. If you filled out those surveys, we're looking at those for specific information. If you ask me specifically what were the most comments on one particular thing, I'm not going to be able to answer that tonight. But I will be over time once I get a chance to dig into the recent results that you all have sent in. So I really appreciate that. It's a great help. I will say that from the early time that we started this to just these last few days, at the very high level, the results haven't changed these bar charts too much. There's a lot of across the board answers. There's very few of these where everybody's on one side or everybody's on the other. And what's challenging about that is if we are going to create land use regulations, we want to make sure that we're managing both ends of the spectrum here when we're looking at those individual issues. Now, when I say we did the survey and you filled it out, it's not a scientific survey. This is not some kind of random sample that we project with 3% accuracy exactly what the whole township thinks. It's not that kind of a survey because it's voluntary response, right? So what we use the survey information for is literally, I look more really at the comments than I do at just kind of the total numbers, and we use it for developing issues, understanding kind of general sentiment about particular things, people that bring up thoughts that maybe we hadn't accounted for yet. So it's really an issue generator for us as much as anything else. it gives us an overview of how sentiments or feelings about one particular issue might happen. But we really use it as an idea to make sure that we're trying to make sure that we cover that waterfront and address the issues that are important to you. I can sit in my office and do one of these because I work for townships and whatever else, but I'm not going to hit all the issues that are most important to you. So that's what the value is here. Find out what those things are now. Can really make ensure that we are hitting the right points, and then not just hitting the right points, but also leaving alone the things that you don't really want to have messed with. So that's entirely valid approach to zoning. Things that you don't want the town's regulations to deal with, you can set those aside. Part of my professional role is going to be, well, other townships have done this. Are you interested in that? Yes, no, maybe. Somewhere in the middle. Bringing those issues before you and the board, and making sure that you're aware of the extent of the things that might go into these kinds of land use regulations, and then decide where you want to be, which ones you want to leave alone, which ones you want to adopt, and then if you adopt them, where you want to be on the scale of these lot sizes or this kind of home-based business kind of language. Those kinds of things go into that. So that is really where, again, the survey results are very helpful, and we're kind of on the swing toward getting close to making some decisions about which way we go on these. So I really appreciate tonight's attendance and your survey responses as well. If you haven't filled out the survey, it's still open, so knock yourself out. I'll take them all. So it's great. One of the things I want to talk about is, and Katie mentioned, comprehensive plan and zoning and subdivision regulations. And what are those things? A comprehensive plan is a land use policy document. In that document, you talk about the kinds of land uses that are important to you. You talk about the goals that the township has for your future, your next several years, maybe several decades. What kind of a place you want Chengwatan Township to be. And then on the ordinance side, you adopt the regulations if you choose to say, okay, here's how we're going to get there. Here's how we're going to accomplish this goal. Make sure that we reach this kind of vision for our community. All that vision and goals, that's spelled out in the comp plan. The more detailed, kind of everyday how to do it stuff in the zoning subdivision regulations. So I kind of put together in the yellow side here policy and goal statements that I kind of picked up from our discussion so far. And we'll talk about, I mentioned the first one, and the first one I heard a lot. Allow as broad a range of property rights as possible without negatively impacting neighbor beyond normal residential impacts. So that seems to me to be the one that bubbles up to the top all the time. There's a bunch of other things, but what we want to do if we're going to adopt regulations is give everybody as much freedom to use their property as they can. And that caveat is always, okay, where am I crossing the line? Or where's the neighbor crossing the line? I expect the neighbor can do these things because this is what is the right thing to do. But at some point, they're no longer being civil neighbors. And that's, we want to find that boundary as best we can. And that's what that first one is all about. I talk about land uses in the township being primarily agricultural and residential. There's a little bit of business going on. Most of the business in this community that's not agricultural business is home-based business. And so how do we ensure that those things can happen in a way that everyone's comfortable with? People that are operating their businesses out of their homes or on their property can continue to do so. Again, with that threshold of at what point do we cross over and bug our neighbors too much with it, and try and create some language around that idea. Third one, business uses may be allowed, but they have to be designed to be primarily an extension of home-based business, like I said, only minimally as freestanding business operations. So if you do allow business property to develop, how are you going to regulate it? What kind of rules are going to apply to it? How can it benefit the community and the property owner, the business owner, without changing the character of your community, which is dominantly agricultural and rural residential. Fourth one I have up here is majority of non-residential uses on residential properties should be located within buildings to ensure compatibility with residential uses. So in a lot of cases I see towns saying, well, we want people to be able to operate businesses on their property, their own business, they live on acreage. One of the best ways to make sure it doesn't bug your neighbors too much is if it's mostly indoors. And so as things start spreading out over the landscape, that's when I see communities start raising, neighbors starting to raise complaints. And sometimes it seems a little silly to us, but one of the things that home businesses generate the most complaints over are visual. Sometimes there's noise, sometimes there's traffic, and those kinds of things. But visual things are one of the biggest things that get neighbors stirred up about business activity. So the more indoors we can keep things, by far the happier the neighborhood tends to be. Talk about larger lot sizes and setbacks and buffering. So if there's business activity going on, particularly if it's a distinctly business property, making sure that there's space for that to happen. And it's not just bumping right up against neighboring property line. I continued on here with agriculture. Agriculture is protected, it's supported, but it also is designed to, at least at this level, designed to allow those farmers, when they're done farming, if they're not going to turn that farm over to a neighbor who wants to buy their land, or a son or daughter who wants to continue farming, if they're done farming, to allow them to make use of their land just like many have already done, and put some residential uses on their property, with obviously consistent with the pattern that's already been established. So it's still a rural community, and Woodbury here in the middle of Chengwatan. And agricultural uses, the intent is that they are traditionally appropriate agricultural in nature: crop, animal farming, farm stand sales, limited processing of agricultural produce, usually for wholesale transport to off-site processing. So that'd be kind of a classic farming situation. Now we might have some more industrial farming kind of activities. There are regulations at PCA level about confinement areas, feedlots, that kind of thing. But so we kind of find the area where we still support our farms and do so in a way that allows it to happen and continues the character here. And the question is whether the county needs to be involved in that side of it at all. Perhaps we just rely on state level pollution regulations and don't get too much farther along the line. That's one of the things we're exploring right now. Non-agricultural uses. One of the things that we see in a lot of places, in areas that are zoned and being used as ag, is kind of non-agricultural uses pop up. All of a sudden, now somebody's got an event center going on, or their vineyard or their orchard now also has an entertainment facility on it. Those kinds of things only allowed perhaps under some kind of special processing. Again, the intent here is to maintain agricultural and residential character, not heavy business on properties that interfere with what everybody might expect to be a kind of a bucolic residential rural area. So that introduction of those kinds of uses is something you want to take care of. in a measured way. We talked about the density a little bit in the policy section here, but it's also more of a zoning thing, and that's what kind of lot sizes, what kind of setbacks apply. One of the things that the board has told me is they want to be able to reflect what's going on around you in the towns that are around you, Pine City Township, or some of the other town areas in the township areas, and kind of be consistent reasonably, if it makes sense to be consistent with the county. And generally, that's kind of 5 acres as a lot size threshold for residential. A lower threshold is very common in Seward areas, and obviously Chengwatan has some of that along the east side of the lake. So there's a reason to consider lower densities, let me say higher densities, along the lake, if there's sewer available to those parcels, so that there's a balance act here. And one of the things that we're exploring is whether we create separate zoning districts for those, or we just say it's kind of one big zoning district, but if you're a rural residential, you get this lot size. If you have sewer, you get that lot size. If you're business, you have to have something else. It's possible to do that all in one district, and so that's kind of a wonky planning thing, but one of the things that we're working through right now. We want to make sure we create adequate spacing between residential uses. Again, when we're talking about rural residential, we're not talking about Woodbury. We're talking about spacing between, you still have neighbors, but your neighbors are several hundred feet away. I live in a township, my neighbors are 500 or 600 feet away. That's the way I like it. Trying to find out, again, what that reasonable distance is to keep our rural character, and so people have the open space that they expect when they come to Chengwatan. We want to ensure that subdivision design, if it happens, somebody wants to split their property and create some rural residential lots, that they're doing so in a way that facilitates reasonable long-term expansion of that. So if farmer A decides to split off some lots out of his 80, and he's got to create a new township road to do that, we want to make sure that that township road is going to go somewhere, so that the next farmer, farmer B, can eventually do his 80, and do so in a way that we don't just have a bunch of inefficient township maintenance responsibilities as a result. So when we have subdivision review, we just want to make sure that everybody's getting a look at it. We're doing that in a way that it doesn't just drive up township maintenance costs, so somebody can have another 5-acre lot. So that's the point of that policy, is just to make sure that you're looking at those things and accounting for them. And your code will say, here's the process to do that, and the process you go through to both do your subdivision and take a look at it, make sure it makes sense for everyone. When subdivisions happen, somebody's thinking, well, this is my property, I'm going to split it up into X number of 5-acre lots, and that they all meet the code, and but it's going to be the town, the citizens here, the taxpayers, that are then responsible for plowing the streets and whatever it may be long term. So you have an interest in what those what that land use looks like long term, and we would just want to make sure that those interests are accounted for. Not to cut down on people's property rights, but to make sure they're done logically and efficiently. It was my understanding when I first met with the town board that they are amenable to the idea that new town roads may occur as a part of subdivision of these larger parcels. That I haven't had a whole lot more conversation with the board on that. Obviously, more roads mean more maintenance, but on the other hand, more roads mean more houses, and so there's a balancing act for you. Otherwise, you keep all your subdivisions on the existing roadways, most of the county roads. That's an easy way for townships to do subdivision and kind of pass all the road costs to the county, but problem is the county has the authority to decide how much access gets to their county roads. And also, if you've got a property that's a quarter section deep, having a whole bunch of matchstick lots doesn't really leave anybody a rural subdivision feel, typically. So anyway, that becomes a design factor in your land use management. We also want to make sure that there's a process that new subdivisions account for other jurisdictions, whether it's soil and water or county roads in some cases. What else I have on my list here? Sewer district, other jurisdictions have an interest sometimes, so we make sure that people who are trying to subdivide their land, whether it's just a couple of lots out of a 20 or a larger farm, that we're accounting for the other interests there, that so they don't run afoul of that and get turned back at the recorder's office. And finally, we want to think about one of the things that zoning gets used for a lot is kind of junk, nuisance, those kinds of things. One of the issues that rural areas have routinely is accumulation of stuff. We have a lot of land. It's easy to put something out in the back or over on the side, and then there's a couple of things, and then there's a little more. And rural areas have a problem with that a lot of times. So we want to make sure that we've got that clearly defined, and so you have a process for dealing with it if it becomes a problem for you. My business partner has been over the last several months been dealing with some county junk accumulation in a township north of here, and I wish I could think of the township, but anyway, it's one of those things that happens in rural areas. So it's pretty common for your ordinance to have some language about nuisance and junk accumulation, those kinds of things. So that's kind of the last thing on that list. I identified a few in a companion piece as to ordinance type or explanation things that kind of go along with these policy statements. I love the idea of hearing from you about which of these sound right, which of those don't sound right, if they've gone too far, or if we left something off here that you think, why the heck aren't they thinking about that? That's what I want to hear from you tonight. Or if you go online and look at the pictures, or take a picture of this and think of something, pass those comments on, whether it's through the survey, if you haven't done it yet, or just an email, because I want to make sure that I've got as much feedback on these ideas as possible, and so that if we do get to the point of adopting something, it's doing the best job we can, like I said, from the outset. I want to talk a little bit about zoning. 100 years ago or so, there was no zoning that didn't exist. Probably a little more than 100 now. And when property owners had disputes about things that were didn't seem right to them from their neighbors' use of their property, their remedy was to file a lawsuit, a nuisance lawsuit against their neighbor, saying that the neighbor's use of their property is unreasonable. It's unreasonably affecting the rights that I have to use my property. And for 500 years, starting in England and now and then in the U.S., that's how people protected their property. They had to file lawsuits. So lawsuits are expensive. If you do file one and you go in front of the court, it's a little bit of a dice roll as to where the court's going to come out, and people didn't like the system very much. So somebody decided that the better way to do this, and don't laugh, was the idea that the government would take over control. So, I told you not to look. That if we had a set of regulations that said, here's what you can expect to use your property, and here's what you can expect your neighbor to use their property, and as long as we're doing what the expectations are, then nobody's got a right to complain. That you may not like the fact that they're out there on their mower during your patio party, but that's their right. They're going to mow their own. So basically, it's all about what your expectations are of your property, what your expectations are rightfully can be about your neighbors' use of their property. And so zoning regulations kind of started to form to limit the kinds and the amounts of uses that can occur on different parcels. And it's evolved like any government thing, right? Immensely since then. But I wanted to walk through a little bit about what would commonly occur and be a component of a zoning ordinance, and so you can understand the kinds of things that are in there, and a little bit about where we think we might be headed, again, at a very draft early stage. There's always a purpose statement, and the purpose statement nobody reads, but it's important because it's what the statutes say you can do. And it's the state of Minnesota that has the authority to regulate land use, and then in the statutes they give that to the local governments. And they say if you're a city, or if you're a county, or if you're a township, you can regulate your own land use. And the purpose of that is protection of health, safety, and welfare. Those are the if you've ever heard that phrase, those are called police powers. It doesn't necessarily mean police. Basically, local governments have the right to regulate land use for protection of health, safety, and welfare. So if there's an unhealthy situation, it's unsafe, or, and what zoning deals with a lot is the character of your community. Zoning is a legitimate, or land use regulation generally, is a legitimate function for the local government to do. You can choose not to do it, and kind of leave it unzoned like it is now, but you have the authority to do that. So it's an option. In my view, now that the county's taken over or adopted their own regulations, I think it's probably likely that zoning's coming down the pike. At one point or another, I think the board's position here is, assuming that to be true, let's try and get a hold of it at a local level rather than at the county level. But anyway, it's a fundamental function that governments have a right to do. The right is limited by a lot of constitutional things, but there's a regulatory authority that's listed right in the statute. And you list that in general purpose. Non-specified uses, that probably really doesn't deserve some category, but I wanted to point out that the way zoning ordinances are structured is they usually say you can do this, you can do that, you can do that. And maybe a little of that and some of that. And if it's not listed, then the presumption is you can't do it. So there's a kind of a negative presumption built into the code. The codes don't have to say everything that's okay and everything that's not okay. They just say these things are okay and the rest of the stuff is not. And if you want to get a code that allows that sixth thing, then you have to come in and get your code amended. So there's a process for that. We'll talk a little bit about that too. But that's just a general assumption of code. So if you read, I'm sure you're all reading zoning ordinances all the time. You'll see that that the presumption is when it says you can do these 6 things, that's what you can do. And it had 7 or 8 or 9, so then there's a process to amend the code to do that. Codes always have definitions. Almost nobody reads them, which is really a travesty because the definitions are almost the guts of a zoning ordinance. When a code says lot width, how do you measure lot width? The only way you know that is if you read the definition, which everybody thinks, oh, I know what lot width is. Well, there's a definition tells you exactly how to measure how building height, how tall is a building. Well, if you have a building that has a gabled sloped roof on it, how tall is it? Your definitions tell you how to read and measure height. So all the and those are just basic things, but definitions are a key part of the code. We're working through a whole bunch of definitions right now to make sure that we've been as comprehensive as we can to make sure that shows up in your code and does a good job. Like I said, almost nobody reads them. They see something in the district and they call town and they complain about it, and then they realize, oh, the definition's out there. So it's an important part of every code. Nonconformities. Non-conforming uses, you probably have heard the term grandfathered uses or grandfathered structures. And this is one that gets a lot of confusion, but it's very important. Because when let's assume the town adopts a zoning ordinance. All of a sudden now we have zoning regulations that say all these things about lot size and building location and all these things. Well, if you're a existing lot or your existing building that doesn't comply with those new codes, you're grandfathered in. Grandfather is not a legal term, but your legal nonconformity is the way the statutory language reads. And that means you can continue doing exactly what you've been doing. You can, you don't have to change your lot. You don't have to go buy land from your neighbor. You don't have to move your house so that it meets the setback. It's legally non-conforming where it is. And if the thing burns down, if you blow a bulldozer through it, you can build it back up. There's rules about that, but not too long ago, there were rules about if you destroyed a portion of your building, then there was this 50% value rule. That's all gone out of the statute now. So if you have a building and it's not where it's supposed to be on your property, it's legally non-conforming because you didn't have zoning before, so it was established legally when it was built. And now the new regulations say it's supposed to be over here instead of there. Doesn't matter, you can keep it where it is, you can rebuild it, you can remodel it. The one thing the statute says is you can't expand it, you can't make it more non-conforming. So there is a limitation there, but you don't lose it. If you have a use on the property, let's say, there may be this out there, but let's say there's a business activity that is going on in the township, and we adopt a code that says that you can't have that business in this town. That business activity is legally non-conforming. It's allowed to continue. As long as they don't expand, they can continue. They can sell that business to another operator, and then somebody else can move onto that property and continue running that business. So that's the non-conforming section of the code is important. It's misunderstood a lot, especially because the statutes changed the rules. So there's a lot of confusion about it, but the new code doesn't mean any. New code says here's what you're supposed to do if you're new, and what you are is still what you are. And that's a real short non-conformity lesson, but that's the essence of it. Every code has a process section, and I talk a little bit about procedural stuff, constitutional stuff. There's limitation on what the local government can do with regulations, and so there's due process that's provided to anybody who wants a permit or some kind of special request or zoning. And the way the statute works and the way your code will work is there's a public hearing that gets held. It's noticed according to the statutory requirements. Everybody gets a chance to speak. In most cases, planning commission will hold that public hearing. They make a recommendation, and the town board then says, okay, we take the recommendation of the planning commission. Here's what we're going to do about that particular issue. If you don't like that outcome, you have a right to appeal that to district court. Those processes are all spelled out in this section of the code. And the rules that the town has to play by are all spelled out in that section of the code too. Here are the factors that the planning commission, the town board, have to take into account when they're hearing a don't know if you've heard this term, but, local governments, they serve as, kind of quasi-judicial, governments when they're making decisions about this kind of thing. They're like, court. And somebody's bringing a request to them, they have specific rules that the town board and land commission have to play by. When they're hearing your case, they're acting like a court, and the rules that are in the code. When they're adopting a code, they're quasi-judicial, or a quasi-legislative, sorry. They're acting like a legislature. So those are the two things local governments do. It's why I like, the way the system is, that local government has the control here. Not the county, not the state, people I don't know. It's my neighbors that manage my land use in my community, and you would be the ones that manage the land use in your community. And you can't just be, there's another term, arbitrary and capricious. You cannot be arbitrary. You have to deal with the case that's before you according to the law. And so that process is all spelled out in your code. It's spelled out in statute, but it's put into your code as well. Common thing in the in zoning ordinances are the districts. Probably if I asked you about a zoning ordinance, you'd probably say, oh, there's an ag district, or there's a residential district you might be familiar with. And they'll say, these are the kinds of uses that can happen in a particular district. Like I said, we're still kind of exploring the idea of whether we have one big district that lists all the requirements and the things that can go in that district, or if we split it up into a few. There's some advantages and disadvantages to both. So, but the district lists the kinds of uses that can go in the individual district, and then the standards that apply in that district. You know, what kind of lot size is the requirement in that district? What are the setbacks? How far does the building have to be from the road or from the neighboring property lines? Those kinds of things are all spelled out because they are specific to each district, and they change. If you create a new district, it's because you want different uses, different standards. And the local government has a lot of flexibility between districts, but within a single district, less flexibility because the same rules are supposed to apply. And then a section of general standards. You'll see in a code they'll have these are standards that typically apply regardless of where you are. So you'll have language in that section that talks about accessory buildings and guest homes or short-term rental. You'll have language in this section that talks about mining, perhaps, or wind energy or solar farms, and talk about the kinds of things, standards that would apply to other specific uses. So if you're a farmer, you might find that in the general section, language related to feedlots, if you were to adopt something like that, might be in the general standards section, because it would apply to any farm with feedlot. Home-based business language is usually in this section, because home-based businesses might be able to occur in any home, so it's a general standard that applies to the board. And then there are a number of others, depends on the kinds of things that the town decides to include, if you decide to include anything else. Beyond, there's all kinds of potential things that zoning ordinances can include. And the message I heard is, let's not get too deep into that kind of other stuff. Let's stay and be as open and flexible with everybody's land uses as possible. In each district, I kind of jumped by here, but permitted uses, things that are allowed, the frontage, the lot size, those kinds of rules. In each individual district, all this language will be setbacks. Right now, we're looking at, I mentioned, 5-acre lots, probably as the dominant. That's a very common lot size for the areas around you. Our county has that rule that applies to a lot of rural residential, and then some smaller lot size in Stewart areas. And then there's a thing called conditional use permits or interim use permits. And you might have heard of these if you've done any meeting or watched any news reports. in zoning district, there are certain things that are permitted. So if you're in a residential district, we're gonna say single-family residences are permitted uses in a residential district. If you wanna build a house and you got a lot and you're gonna build it where it's supposed to be built, and you come in and get a building permit, and that's all you gotta do. There's no planning commission, there's no town board, anything like that. It's a permitted use. There's another class of use called conditional uses, and those are uses that might be allowed, but you have to show that your use is going to not just meet the code, but not create any unintended impacts. Let's imagine that we create a zoning district that allows certain business uses by conditional use permit. That means they need to come in, they need to file an application, there's a public hearing that's held at planning commission typically. They need to show why their traffic isn't going to overwhelm the neighborhood, or why they're not going to create noise or lights that are going to bother their neighbors, or they're far enough away from those locations. That's the condition use. There are conditions that need to be attached to that particular kind of use. Your district will identify those in the language that says that about those particular uses. And then there's a process for the property owner to come through and request that permit. And just like I was saying before, there's a specific set of standards that the town board and planning commission have to use to review that permit. They don't just get to go. Jim's a pretty good guy. We'll give him. Doesn't matter, nicest guy in the world. So that's the bulk of it. I mentioned other regulations. There's a couple other important ones that we'll be dealing with. One is shoreline, and one is floodplain. When your community has shoreline along both the river and along the lake, the DNR sets the standards and the rules for where that line is. The DNR also has a model ordinance for dealing with lands in those shoreline areas. So we'll want to create some regulations there. A lot of shoreline ordinances are pretty formula, because the DNR has been pretty specific about the things they want in those codes, and your shoreline ordinance has to be signed off on by the DNR. So we don't get to go too far afield of what those rules are, but we do want the regulation again at the local level, so that if there's a reason for considering a variance or something else, it's heard in your town instead of at county level or some other level. And floodplain, same thing. Floodplain almost really floodplain issues are if you've got land in a floodplain, it talks about filling rules and things like that. It usually doesn't come into play, but it's a regulation you need to have. So again, a very formula kind of set of regs that the DNR hands down. And floodplain stuff actually comes from the feds, so you're under on that. But we still, it doesn't really affect too many people unless you are literally in a floodplain. You're trying to, and you've got structures in a floodplain, you've got a problem. So then you need to grapple with that ordinance. But the reason you want the ordinance is because if you qualify for flood insurance, you need to have the regulations in place. Otherwise, you don't get to buy the flood insurance. And then finally, subdivision. I talked a lot about zoning, but subdivision ordinances go along with zoning. When people have to meet lot size, they have to meet if they're going to dedicate a road. If the town has the authority to require dedication of the roadways, of easements, and even parkland if you decide to do that. It's under the subdivision ordinance. So we'll be generating some subdivision ordinances. There's some good models out there for from the places around Chengwatan, so we'll probably be following a lot of that pattern. Another set of regulations, but Zoning is the one that gets, that has the star power, right? So, we talk about that a lot. That's, everything I wanted to say tonight from a presentation standpoint. I'm sure you're happy to hear that. And, I'd be happy if we wanna just kind of, have open questions from the floor, and then otherwise